Hello, everyone, and welcome to this conversation about how to thrive as a sensitive person in an overwhelming world. My name is Julia Wheeler. I'm a writer and I chair events at science and literature festivals in the UK and overseas. And it is my huge pleasure to introduce and welcome tonight's guest, who is a co-author of the book Sensitive. Andre Sólo is the co-founder and editor-in-chief of the website Sensitive Refuge. It's the largest website of its kind dedicated to sensitive people, and a sensitive person himself, Andre has come to recognize the potential of that trait as the superpower that it can be. Andre, welcome to the How To Academy.
Thank you for having me, Julia. I'm excited to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you here and to delve into this book that we can see behind you, Sensitive. So I've said that you are, I'm not going to say self-confessed, sensitive person, because we'll perhaps get onto that side of things. But you are a sensitive person, and I wonder whether you could give us an idea of how that exhibited itself as you grew up, and also when you came to realize that this was actually something to be celebrated.
Absolutely, yeah. So I'm a sensitive person. I've always been sensitive. Generally speaking, if you're sensitive, it's mostly genetic, so you're going to be that way your whole life. But as a kid, I did not know that that's what I was. I didn't have that word for it. And I remember when I started kindergarten, which I guess is kind of like nursery school, the classroom was fine. I did fine in class, learning my ABCs and things like that. But once we were out on the playground for recess, things changed. Suddenly there were hundreds of kids running every direction, screaming, yelling, laughing, sometimes fighting, right? And it was just overstimulating. And I would get overloaded, and I didn't know why. I didn't know it was overstimulation, but I knew I needed to get out of there. So I would actually run away and hide. And I looked for anywhere quiet I could go. The only quiet place I could find was actually a storm sewer opening near the edge of the school grounds. So I would get in there, nice and quiet, soothing, and just relax until recess was over. And then I'd hear the bell and run back to school like this, no problem. Well, that went on for a little while until the teachers found out where I was going. And then it was a big problem. Apparently, that's not where they want students to be during recess.
Who knew?
Yeah, right. So they called my parents. I got quite the talking to, and everybody was really alarmed. Like, why are you doing this? You know, it seemed like this huge problem. And I didn't understand why. It's like, well, it's nice and quiet. And I came back. But that was the first time I realized that there's something really different about the way I experience the world. And, you know, we didn't have the word sensitive. That wasn't explained to me. So, and it had caused a big problem. So I began to get the idea that there was something wrong with me. And it wasn't until I was an adult that I began to dig into the research behind sensitivity and realized, wow, this is a trait that's not only is it normal, not only is there nothing wrong with me, I'm just sensitive, but this is a trait that's linked to a lot of powerful strengths. This is actually a good thing. And that was a life-changing moment for me.
So in terms of characteristics, you've described some of the things that affected you, but there are lots more. So if people are wondering whether they come under this heading sensitive, what would you say the main things to look out for are?
Let's start by just talking about what it means to be sensitive, right? Because I think this word has a lot of meanings. And when we hear the word sensitive, we often think of being weak or fragile, or maybe overreacting to things or out of control emotions, right? And that's just not what being sensitive means. So as a personality trait, being sensitive means you take in more information from the world around you and you do more with it. What I mean by that is that sensitive people are actually wired at a brain level to process all information more deeply. So they put more time, more attention, more mental resources into processing information, thinking about it, ruminating on it, sitting with it, and starting to notice maybe details and connections that other people might not have noticed. And that comes out in a lot of ways, right? Because there's so many different kinds of information that the brain gets. So obviously there's sensory information you're getting through your five senses. And so a sensitive person might be the person who notices that like scratchy texture of a fabric that bothers them but doesn't bother anyone else. Or they might notice that delicate note of apricot in a nice white wine that no one else can detect. And you have this sensory kind of side of sensitivity. But information to the brain can also be emotional. And in a lot of ways, that's the most important information we have. So we're always bringing in, social cues, emotional cues from the people around us, and sensitive people go deeper with that too. So if you're a highly sensitive person, you might be the only one who notices that little like hint of a smile that flashes across someone's face before they manage to hide it. And you might have this kind of sixth sense about like, wait, that person's lying, or wait, I don't think that person means what everyone else thinks they mean. Um, those are both signs of being sensitive. And those two sides of sensitivity, the physical and the emotional, those are so closely related that in one study, we actually see that if you take Tylenol, which is like paracetamol, if you take that to numb a headache, you'll actually score lower on an empathy test until that medication wears off. So these two things go tightly together, the emotional and the physical sensitivity, and also just deep thinking. Because if you're doing all that extra processing, you tend to make connections that other people don't make between ideas. And so sensitive people will tend to have powerful gifts. They'll tend to be very creative. They'll tend to have a high sense of empathy and compassion because of that's a connection to other people's emotions. And they tend to be very aware of their physical surroundings. And those are things you can see in yourself. You might also notice that you are very aesthetically sensitive. So sensitive people are often very moved by artwork and beauty and meaning. If you're the kind of person who might cry during a movie or cry during a piece of music, or you just feel emotionally moved when you look at a piece of artwork, those might be signs that you're a sensitive person as well. And there is a test you can take. We have that on our website, Sensitive Refuge, but you can kind of see those signs in your own life or in other people around you and get a pretty good idea.
You talk in the book actually about another word for sensitivity being responsiveness, that the sensitive people respond more, which is so much more positive in the general use of the language, isn't it?
Yeah. Right. So, when we talk about sensitivity, it's just like any other healthy trait. It's a continuum, right? Everyone is sensitive to some degree. We all have a sensitive side, but some people are more sensitive than others. So what we see is most people are in the middle of the continuum. They're average. Some people are at the lower end, and some people, about 30% of all people, score high for sensitivity. And that's the same numbers for both men and women, and as far as we know, all people of all genders. So nature kind of made this choice, right? Natural selection kind of like made this experiment of every creature in the universe has to take in information from its environment and respond to it somehow. Even plants do that. They detect, there's a drought going on, so I'll notice that and I'll change the way I'm using my water. But the question is, what if you turned up the dial, where some creatures do that more? They filter out less information, they take more time with it, and they process it more before responding to it more strongly. And other creatures do that less. And nature tried this experiment, and it turns out that higher sensitivity can be very, very useful. And that's why it's 30% of the population, not like 1% or 2%, because it really pays off. And it's also why we see sensitivity in other species, and not just primates, which kind of makes sense, they're closely related to us, but also things like fish and bugs. Will have individuals who are more sensitive or less sensitive in the same way. So it's this ability to take things in and respond to the environment that gives you all these traits of being a sensitive person.
You say in the book that your readership is threefold. It's those people who know already that they're sensitive. People have to say, like me, who are thinking, oh, maybe, yeah, okay, that makes sense. But also the third group is treasured guests. Now, tell us what you mean by these treasured guests.
Right. Treasured guests are the people who maybe you have a sensitive person in your life, right? If 1 in 3 people out there are highly sensitive, well, if it's not you, it's going to be your spouse or one of your parents or one of your children or one of your best friends or someone you work with. You certainly have sensitive people in your life. And by treasured guest, we mean there's this stigma around being sensitive. There's this cultural perception that sensitive is a bad thing. You should either get rid of it or hide it, just kind of make it go away, when in reality, it's a trait that's linked to giftedness. And so we want, of course, the book to serve people who are sensitive and be a journey of self-discovery and help empower you to embrace your sensitivity and use those gifts. But it's also important for us that the people who are not sensitive start to get a hold of this book. And what we've often seen is that people who are highly sensitive will ask people in their life. They might send them an article from our website. They might give them a copy of our book, but they'll say, hey, could you read this? This really understands me. And they're looking for that sense of like the people around them starting to see these strengths, or at least see and accept who they are.
Yeah, and to work with them in a different way. So you mentioned empathy. This is a gift of responsiveness, of sensitivity. Talk to us about how it's a gift, but then we'll move on to actually sometimes how it can be a negative thing for the people who are so empathetic. So let's talk about the positive to start with.
Right. Yeah, so empathy is a topic that I think sounds really kind of soft to a lot of people. It's this sort of emotional, fuzzy topic. In reality, there's a lot of hard science to empathy. Empathy is an important human characteristic. So this is really what allows us to be a social species and to work together in groups and cooperate and form societies. And it's why we are able to do that. And at the brain level, I think we've all probably heard of mirror neurons, right? We have these neurons that allow us to kind of mirror the emotions of other people and sort of get a sense of what that person must be feeling. But what's interesting is mirror neurons did not start off as an emotional system. They started off as motor neurons, the type of neuron that helps you move your physical body. And they started off that way because one of the most essential things for any creature to do, even before it develops a high level of emotionality and intelligence and things like that, is just to be able to copy movements, right? So if you do a dance move, I probably will do a terrible job of imitating it, but I can kind of get the idea and move my arms the same way you just moved your arms, right? It's why when you face the instructor in a yoga class or a fitness class, they do the same movements that they want you to do and you copy it. That's because those motor neurons say, oh, they raised this hand, I'll raise that hand. It was only over time, most likely, that species began to sort of use these motor neurons to mirror other things, right? So if somebody smiles a certain way, that's a physical set of movements. And my motor neurons my mirror neurons, I should say, know how to move my face to do the same thing. And we know what it feels like. We know what I would be thinking and feeling if I smiled that same way. And so we start to use our mirror neurons as a sort of a simulator. And so we're very powerful simulators of social situations. In your head, you have this computer that can run a simulation of, well, if that person said this and they looked this way at me, they must be thinking and feeling this. And it's a powerful simulation. But just like these other things we've talked about, some people do it to a greater extent than others. Sensitive people, we know, self-report higher levels of empathy. We know they perform higher in empathy tests. And we know that at a brain level, they have greater activation in areas of the brain related to empathy, including the mirror neuron system network, I should say.
And that can also then be exhausting for somebody who is super empathetic.
Yes.
So one of the things that you talk about in the book is turning that into a positive, and the link between empathy and compassion, where we're actually responding, doing something. We have agency, if you like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So empathy can become this real source of pain. I've heard a lot of sensitive people describe it as a curse. And if you think about it, when you're turning that mirror neuron network up that much, you're running that simulation that well, it's not just that you get a hunch like, oh, well, that person must feel this way. You start to feel it yourself because you're running the same simulation in your head. And so sensitive people, not all, but many sensitive people will have the experience of absorbing emotions from other people. So if someone else feels sad, you start to feel deeply sad. And I don't just mean like, oh, I'm sorry your puppy died. It's like you might start crying for someone else's loss. And that can happen even with strangers, even when you don't know what's wrong. A lot of sensitive people will just have the experience of someone around them was stressed out. Maybe it wasn't even someone they were talking to or interacting with, but they just start to get really stressed. And it's, if you've ever heard someone call themselves an empath, that's probably what's really going on. If you looked at it scientifically, is they probably are a highly sensitive person, and this is what's happening inside their brain. So it can be this source of pain. It's not fun to go around the world absorbing all of the stress and anger, because it's kind of a stressed out and angry world, right? And so empathy, even though it's this forcing and bring people together, we also see that in individual interactions, it often makes people pull apart. And this is why when someone else has something bad going on in their life, you start to easily slip into saying things that are kind of these like pat, like cheerful sayings, like, oh, I'm sure it'll all work out. Because that gets you out of the conversation. We can stop doing this uncomfortable thing and I don't have to feel bad right now, right? That's where that toxic cheerfulness comes from. So empathy, it tends to increase your heart rate. It increases the rate of your breathing. It increases the tension you're feeling in your body. It can be unpleasant when you're doing empathy with someone who has a negative emotion, and it can cause people to start to pull away from each other. So in the book, we recommend making a small change, and that change is to start practicing compassion. Now, I personally, I always thought of compassion and empathy as meaning basically the same thing. Researchers do not use it to mean that. When you do compassion, it means you're reaching out and asking questions. It means you're starting to try to understand the other person's perspective. Maybe you already feel what they're feeling, that's your empathy, but do you understand how they see it? Do you understand their perspective and their experience? And that's where you start to ask questions, and especially open-ended questions, especially questions that are about their emotions, and just let them fill in the blanks. So things like, oh my God, that must be really scary. And then just, it must be scary, is it? And they'll talk for a little bit. And they start to share their experience. And this does two important things. First of all, it's helpful for them. It's helpful for them because they feel that they're getting attention. They can tell someone cares. And that process of talking it out, which maybe no one else has asked them to do, they start to get perspective on it. And maybe they start to see, it's not always possible to solve every problem, but they might start to see ways to improve the situation. So it's helpful for them, but also for you as the person who's feeling the empathy and trying to do the compassion. It changes the dynamic. You're no longer focused on what I'm feeling, I feel bad because I picked up their grief. Now you're focused on them, and you're relating to them in this two-directional way. And you're having a conversation which uses not just the emotional part of your brain, but the logical part. And you start to have a different internal feeling. So when people practice compassion this way, what we see is the opposite of empathy. We see that the pulse comes down, the breathing rate comes down, they start to feel positive rather than negative. And rather than wanting to pull away, it brings people together. So it's helpful for both parties.
There's so much within your book about us having power to change things. So let's talk about the sensitive boost effect. We're going to need to do some neuroscience. We're going to need to do some nurture and nature in order to understand that. But again, it's all to do with having that agency, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Right. So there's many, many different gifts that sensitive people come with. We talked about a few of them. Empathy is one, creativity, deep thinking, innovation, great attunement to your physical environment. These are all powerful strengths. I think that perhaps the most powerful gift you have as a sensitive person is what we call the boost effect. The boost effect means that you get more of a benefit out of the same things that would help anybody else. So here's an example. We all know that if a child is raised in a sort of safe, supportive, calm home environment, they'll get better grades in school than if they're raised in a very conflict-driven, chaotic home environment. That's true for all kids, whether you're sensitive or not. But a sensitive kid, if they're given that same safe, healthy home environment, they won't just get better grades on average in school, they might rocket to the top of their class. And we see this at all stages of life, across the board, in study after study after study for sensitive people. So I'll give two examples for teenagers with depression. This is a wonderful study that happened in the UK. The researchers went into one of the most impoverished towns in the UK, and they looked at teenagers who had symptoms of depression, and of course they were living in an environment where it's a lower economic kind of area, lots of difficult home lives, things like that, where you're at high risk for depression, and it's very hard to treat it when there's so much chaos in people's lives. And they gave all of these teenagers the same depression treatment program. And it's an evidence-based program. It's been proven to work in other settings. And sure enough, on average, it did help the teenagers improve their depression symptoms. But once the researchers gave them a sensitivity test, a personality test to determine their sensitivity, something fascinating popped out. Sure, the program helped on average, but the kids who scored as highly sensitive were the ones who not only got some benefit out of it, they tended to go on to completely overcome their depression, not just improve the symptoms. And not only that, every time the researchers would go back, 3 months, 6 months, a year, however many times out they went, the teenagers were still depression-free, oftentimes if they were sensitive, long after the program had ended. So they were able to take that benefit of the program, carry it forward, and just fix that problem in their lives because of their sensitivity. And the other one I'll share is just with adults, the wonderful study that involved couples who were on the brink of divorce, and they were given a relationship skills training class. And sure enough, once again, it helped improve it. It brought down the divorce rates on average compared to couples who didn't get the program. But when researchers assessed their sensitivity, this time, I believe, using a genetic test, they found that couples who had a sensitive person in them, even just one of the two people was sensitive, they didn't just first of all, they were much more likely to avoid divorce and keep their marriage together. So that program paid off more for them. But not only that, they actually improved the quality of their relationship. So they actually became happier with their partners rather than just staying together miserably. And that was an effect that they did not see with the less sensitive people, that improvement in relationship quality. So this is the boost effect. And the powerful thing about the boost effect is you can trigger it yourself. You don't have to just be the lucky kid who got the nice upbringing. Throughout your life, you can trigger the boost effect by getting a mentor, taking a career training class or some kind of development program, starting therapy if you are not already in therapy, taking coaching, all kinds of things, and especially just starting to curate the relationships in your life, starting to look at which of my friends are the people who encourage me and build me up and make me think I can do more, and which of my friends are the ones who maybe make me feel torn down a little bit. And I'm going to spend less time with those friends and more time with the people who encourage and support me. And you're creating that supportive environment for yourself. And if you're a highly sensitive person, you are walking around with a rocket engine on your back. And the only thing you have to do to ignite it is to start to curate that supportive environment.
I love the phrase.